Kill the Indian, Save the Man has the most interesting and poignant cover. As you can see, it shows a young boy dressed in the clothing of his Native American tribe, and then the same youngster dressed in the clothing worn by other young boys in the United States and Canada in the 19th century. Ward Churchill has chosen that picture to illustrate the theme of his book about the American Indian residential schools and their lasting effect on the Native American population in this country and Canada. Mr. Churchill is a professor of American Studies at the University of Colorado, a member of the Leadership Council of the American Indian Movement of Colorado, past national spokesperson for the Leonard Peltier Defense Committee, delegate to the United Nations Working Group on Indigenous Populations, and a member of the People's International Tribunal. And plus, with all of that, he is a prolific writer and a well-known speaker on Native American issues. This book explores a policy little known to many of us of the United States and Canadian governments that put Native American children in residential schools away from their families and culture. A situation, Mr. Churchill writes, that has led to social disintegration and has resulted in the ills that have plagued the Native American peoples. Publishers Weekly has said of Mr. Churchill that he is, and I quote, one of the most outspoken of Native American activists and an amazing, consistent, and perceptive writer. Please join me in welcoming Ward Churchill.
Seal, I'll see you. Hello, my relatives. Good to see you here. It's a hard book for me to talk about, actually. The hardest book I ever wrote. And maybe in the course of my comments, you'll see why. But I suppose the first point is that it's an add-on in a way. Got an earlier book titled Little Matter of Genocide, which goes on for 500-odd pages, chronicling the forms, the modes, the impacts, so on, of policies of the United States, of Canada, of antecedent colonial powers by the indigenous population, all to the purpose of demonstrating the appropriateness and applicability of genocide properly understood, that is, within the domain of its original connotation, when Raphael Lemkin coined the term in 1944, and actually within the legal definition posited in the 1948 Convention on Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide. And with all that, I left out quite a lot. And the quite a lot that I left out included the impacts of what the United States somewhat euphemistically referred to as assimilation policy. I do touch upon it. I do mention the dimension of schooling in that process in A Little Matter of Genocide, but there is no development thematically. And in the aftermath of having written that, I was aware of it. As we are all aware of things in a sort of abstract way, not personal. Well, I got crash course in the personal experience of the effects of that system after A Little Matter of Genocide was published. So this book really is a chunk of what's missing in the larger book that preceded it. And the general structure of what's presented in there is as follows. That is, at the end of an overt policy of extermination, and that's not my term, that's the term utilized by figures like Governor Evans of Colorado Territory at the time of the Sand Creek Massacre and quite a number of other renowned figures in American history. The extermination policy was phased out as being detrimental to the interests of the United States in several ways. One, it was becoming increasingly cost prohibitive to track down the hardcore recalcitrants, Geronimo's Chiricahuas, for example. It was more expensive to take out a Chiricahua fighter by the early 1880s in adjusted dollars than it was to kill an actual Vietnamese combatant during the Indochina affair. And that was very expensive, over $1 million per actual combatant killed in Indochina. And it was doing PR damage to the United States, both at home and abroad. So you have a policy shift that occurs in the mid-1880s from this policy of extermination to a policy of assimilating the residue of survivors. The 1890 census shows only about 250,000 American Indians surviving within the 48 contiguous states area of North America. It was felt that the overburden of white population could simply absorb, digest, if you will, this residue and certain things that went into it. Probably two linchpins defined the whole. One was to attack the cultural integrity that remained among the adults in living the life defined by cultural understanding of indigenous peoples, and that was through the General Allotment Act to break up the collectivity of land holdings that marked traditional land tenure among native peoples pretty comprehensively in North America, and the assignment, imposition, if you will, of individuated land title at about 160 acres a pop. Given the known number of survivors when computed against the acreage, which is about 150 million acres at the time, that remained in native possession, if you assign these parcels, a considerable proportion of the aggregate landholding still in possession of native people could be declared surplus and opened up to homesteading, corporate usage, creation of national parks and forests, military reservations, and so on. And that's the actuality. This undermining of cultural cohesion, the way of doing things, the way of relating to the land and thus to each other, was attacked, redefined in accordance with non-Indian norms, and of that 150 million acres, approximately 100 million acres passed out of Indian ownership and control in the process. That all happened between 1885 and 1934. Actually, it happened more rapidly than that because you had a significant drop-off in allotment after about 1920. So you've got a roughly 35-year period of time where 2/3 of the remaining real assets of native North America are stripped away. That's one wing of the assimilation policy. The other was to go after the children. And it's a theme which is very well grounded, has been practiced by the papacy. It said, give us the children to be raised in a certain way, they will be believers for life. The Nazis said the same thing. And Hitler was actually paraphrasing the Pope when he said basically, Hitler Youth is designed to create those who will believe what it is that we believe and carry that forward into the future. And the same idea was utilized by the Anglo governments of both Canada and the United States and North America. The idea that you could take, and this was the stated objective, it was never completely realized, partly because it was too expensive and the taxpayers wouldn't ante up. But the idea was to take every American Indian child between the ages of 5 and 15 and process them through institutions remote from their families, from their communities, from their societies, from their traditions, and geographically remote for this period of time. And the result would be, as articulated by an Army captain named Richard Henry Pratt, who was essentially the architect of the U.S. system and was emulated in Canada. The outcome, the goal, if achieved, would be the killing of the Indian, the saving of the man in each and every pupil. Now, you have to understand that by man, he meant human, and I think it's a very instructive formulation. He would have been a soundbite artist, I suppose, if he were around today. He was a very impactful individual in the approaches that he had developed to accomplish tasks here. But that formulation pretty much frames how he's going to go at it. To be Indian is a juxtaposition to being human. To be Indian, you cannot be human. To be human, you cannot be Indian. So whether the killing is figurative or literal, it is intended in literal terms as a form of death. That's what the script is to be. During the period 1880 roughly to 1980, now there's antecedents to this that run all the way back into the early 1700s and probably prior to that in individual cases. You've got institutions like Dartmouth and so forth that were started much earlier on. But in a systemic sense, we kick off at the end of the Grant Peace Policy, as it was called, roughly 1880. And we got things that run off the end of it. The last of the old line boarding schools, as they were called in the United States, the Phoenix Indian School, was not closed until 1990. But during the century 1880 to 1980 is when the bulk of everything happens. And during that period, you've got roughly half of each successive generation of Native children that spend all or part of their primary educational time in one of these institutions. Now, where it kicks off, well, before I go to where it kicks off, maybe I should explain a little more about Captain Pratt and how it was that he was considered to be the individual qualified to found the first of these schools in the United States and then to multiply them outward from his template. And it comes like this. Pratt's credentials, his qualification was that he was the warden of the Fort Marion military prison down in Florida, St. Augustine. But Fort Marion wasn't your ordinary military prison, whatever that might be. Fort Marion was consigned to accommodating the hardcore recalcitrant fighting strength, those who refused to stand down, those who were the catalyst of resistance in Native societies in the West. They were transshipped to Fort Marion to be handled by Pratt, who developed techniques basically to break the will of these adult figures who epitomize resistance and turn them into compliant figures that can be used as examples of what the government thinks a good Indian should be. Now you're talking about the last of the really hard-line Cheyenne dog soldiers, you're talking about Satanks Comanches, you're talking about some Kiowas that are pretty notable figures in the end of the Southern Plains resistance. You're talking about the entirety of the Chiricahua Apaches. They showed up, there were too many to be accommodated there, so they split them between Fort Marion and another facility in Mobile, Alabama. Nonetheless, that's the nature of the facility. And the nature of the techniques that he develops to accomplish this are things that are still in use in the penal system today. Now, the techniques for imposing ideological conversion, as they call it now down at Florence or over at Marion, Illinois, have to do with isolation, deprivation, inculcation of a sense of abject dependency, and so on and so on. These are techniques that he develops at Fort Marion, and these techniques are what it is that qualifies him to accomplish this more comprehensive job, not with the Native resistance, but with Native children. He's going to bring these techniques to bear on the kids. The process, well, the process usually begins with trauma because they have a graduated in terms of coercion sequence of techniques employed to get the kids. They'll try suasion. And if they can convince parents to turn over their children for processing in a residential institution, great. Excuse me. On the other hand, and not too awful many parents were inclined to that, the coercion would begin. Well, you're dependent on us for rations. You won't see rations again until you agree to turn over your children. You have head rights having to do with alienation of property, and you use that to get yourself established where you can be economically self-sufficient, but you're not going to see payment of those rights until you agree to turn over your children. And it keeps going up from there. You've got a group of Hopis who were sent to Alcatraz Island for 5 years, exemplary punishment, because this was their only offense. They refused to turn over their children. You've got cases, and many of them, where Bureau of Indian Affairs police were used to physically round up the kids. And this usually results in a clash. The parents are resistant, and they're physically resisting, and they're being overpowered right in front of the children by whatever force turns out to be necessary, up to and including the use of arms. And when the BIA police are insufficient, there are cases when the Army was used to take the children. Well, under these conditions, the nature of the separation from family induces an initial trauma. Them being taken and placed in a mode of transport which is completely alien. None of these kids, to speak of, had ever been on a train. They're being placed on a train with other kids under guard and taken to the Carlisle Barracks in Pennsylvania, taken from the Southwest, say. So they're being put diagonally across a whole chunk of the continent. There's a reason for this. To isolate them in this fashion geographically, very obviously restricts the possibility of any sort of contact and exchange with their families or their communities, representatives thereof, the elders, anyone else, and conversely, you're talking children. Place them in a position like this, they're going to want to run. 7, 8-year-old child's not going to be able to run 1,800 miles to get home. So you're sealing them in, and that's this sense of, in the first instance, absolute dependency. They don't have options and alternatives, and that's being made very clear. So the trauma that they're incurring is being basically replicated in a lower level all the way in transit to the facility, where they are then met by a rather large group of aliens who, it's shock and awe, to borrow a phrase from recent TV commentary, okay? It's technique that you'll encounter in a Marine boot camp or Army basic training. It is to shock, freeze, cause loss of sense of confidence in self. Beginning the process of stripping identity right then and there, right upon admission. And the mission process is, well, everything signifying identity is physically removed. Clothes are taken, replaced with military-style uniforms. Religious items are taken, replaced with rosaries and little Bibles. For boys, hair is shorn, military style. Now this is passed off as being a matter of hygiene. Indians, after all, you understand, in the conception of the dominant society, are inherently dirty, and they're to be informed of that fact. This is the first step of the information. If hygiene were the issue, however, you would be hard-pressed to explain why girls' hair was not shorn. One assumes they're coming from the same context and they would suffer the same maladies having to do with hygienic problems or lice or whatever. No, it's something else. Long hair, American Indian males, has a particular significance culturally, spiritually, in terms of identity. That's being taken away. Long hair for females in a dominant society, however, is approved, and so that's retained. After they've been issued these things, they're taken and they're cleaned. They're dirty Indians, they have to be cleaned. They're being told they're dirty Indians while this is happening. You're coming in, you're filthy, we're going to scrub you. Scrub brushes, hot water, and astringents. Lye was used commonly, kerosene was used various powders later on into the 20th century. And then they're placed in what amounts to a barrack setting. Their life will be regimented from there on. They're using bugles, just like in the Army, to announce various things like get up, fall in. They will be marched in formation to breakfast. They will eat their usually, sometimes toasted, bread, lard, coffee, and sugar for breakfast. Silently, they're not to talk to one another. Fall back out of the mess hall, into formation, be marched to class. Academically, class is kind of a joke. You get the basic 3 R's to be imparted. They want them to be able to read well enough to, say, decipher bills of lading. They want to be able to write well enough to make corrections on these, sign their names, perform these particular functions. Arithmetic, well enough to do basic little accounting tasks, cipher, and so forth, because they're slotted to be manual labor for the dominant society. There's certain skill levels which are useful. They don't want to have them acquire too much by way of skill, but they will get things like history. The history that begins in 1620. The history that explains about the weirdness, the savagery, the obstacle nature of their own heritage, something to be overcome. They also, and it's interesting, they use this word. They get a heavy dose of indoctrination in what's called patriotism, which ultimately starts to work its way out into the notion that the people who fought against their people are heroes, their people are the bad guys. It's how you end up by the late 1950s, coming into the 60s, with Indian kids being taken to the movie theater and cheering when the bugle sounds and the cavalry comes to rescue the hardy pioneers from the savage circling hordes of Indians. Complete reversal of the keys of cognition. And that's about half the morning, and the morning's what's devoted to instruction. Okay? Second half of the morning is going to be on learning Christian virtues, primarily those devolving upon chastity on the one hand, the incredibly sexually repressive sets of instructions that are placed on these kids, to the point where you got this kind of neurotic alienation, sexually speaking, that afflicts a lot of people for the rest of their lives as a result of what they're doing. So that on the one hand, and the virtue of work on the other. You have to work. You have to be doing things you don't enjoy, is what it's being told. You have to suffer in this veil so you can have the promise of the afterlife, and it's for your own good. We're in the process of saving your soul. Okay, bugle sounds, fall out, formation, go to lunch. Bugle sounds, fall in, be marched to work. There's 2 basic types of residential facility. Down here, we tend to call everything a boarding school. North of the border in Canada, they're referred to as residential schools. And residential school is a much more accurate characterization of the institutions, because both south of and north of the border, you can divide these institutions into 2 types. One is a boarding school per se, although most of them don't stay that way very long because they're too underfunded to function simply as schools, residential schools, boarding schools. The other, usually referred to as industrial schools. Carlisle was an industrial school. Its proper name is the Carlisle Indian Industrial School. Encompassed within that, of course, are agricultural schools, and Colorado has quite a lot of experience with this, although the only residential facility was down in Durango. The sugar beet harvest in the 1920s and 30s was rendered profitable by the fact that they were taking child labor from the Haskell Indian School of Canada and putting those kids in the fields to work all summer at discount wages. And at the end of the summer, they might get $5 or whatever, but basically the discounted wage, discounted though it may be, was paid to the school, not to the kids. That's another one of Pratt's innovations, and it ties to this whole notion of people who are incarcerated now being compelled to work in order to subsidize their incarceration to spare the taxpayers the burden. Actually, a lot of penal facilities at this point operating on that model generate a profit. Oregon and Washington State being two examples. I'm not sure what the situation is in Colorado, but the burden of incarcerating ever increasing portions of the populations are much alleviated by that practice, irrespective of where you are or whether an actual profit is generated. Certain of the Indian schools end up generating profits as well. Got a very prideful letter, copy of it, from the guy who was heading up the Chilocco School, and the euphemisms they place on these institutions, I don't know, it hits me kind of hard. Chilocco was referred to as Prairie Light. That's how they advertised it. Sounds really nice, doesn't it? Kids were doing field labor extensive enough during the academic year that they were putting out product that resulted in this letter by which the guy, very proud of himself, man. You can see him patting himself in the back as he's writing it. We actually paid something on the order of $30,000 this year into the state treasury. State of Oklahoma made money by virtue of having Chilocco within its boundaries. Yeah. All kids supposedly being educated. Well, you would go to the shop, you would do leather manufacturing, manufacturing steel goods or ironware. You would go into the fields, you would bale hay, you would cultivate, you would care for livestock, you would do whatever it was that that particular institution had for boys to do. Because we have a sharp delineation on what's appropriate forms of work that need to be taught. These are like, they're trying to put them out as being kind of like VOTEC schools. Now, boys will do these kinds of work. We're going to teach them those skills. So they're going to get their education here for their own good, and they're going to walk out with marketable skills, and they're going to think the way they're supposed to think in order to be acceptable to the dominant society. Well, of course, irrespective of what you've got them thinking during that period, you're dealing with a society which identifies them by phenotype and so despises them that the national policy is to destroy them, either directly physically or in this cultural sense. So you got many cases of people who come out of the residential schools, go back home in, say, Nebraska or South Dakota, who can't get a job on their own land baling hay for a white farmer in the summer. So now, you know, the upshot is that the process has been to render them dysfunctional as Indians so that they don't understand themselves as Indians. They wouldn't know how to be Indians. They're not going to fit into that society, and they're still unacceptable to the dominant society for a reason that they can discern by simply looking in a mirror. So as you're demeaning and degrading Indians and Indianness and the significance of Indian culture in these morning sessions of indoctrination, what are these kids seeing as they absorb that? I mean, you're absolutely destroying the phenotypical, on the basis of the phenotypical response they're going to have just by looking in a mirror, sense of self, sense of self-esteem, sense of self-concept, dignity, pride, all those things automatically. Now, some deal with it in one way, some deal with it another, but that's going to be the outcome straight down the line. And that's in a successful case. This is the objective in a way. They're not saying you're going to have this game with the mirror, but they're delivering a product in a desired state when that's the result. Okay, we got work for males lined out. Females, well, laundries were big, ironing, sewing shops, domestic service. This is during the school year. They're actually operating commercial laundries and manufacturing facilities, seamstress shops, got rows and rows. Looks like the garment district in New York when you look to the inside of one of these things. And somebody asked a question once with regard to the vocational training dimension of this. How many bed sheets do you need to iron before you know how to iron a bed sheet? Yeah? Probably if you're a little slow, you can manage it in 30 days, say. 30 days repetition of ironing bed sheets, you can probably handle that. And like riding a bicycle, you're going to remember how to do that for a while, like life. And you've got kids who are in these commercial facilities ironing bed sheets, patching shirts, darning socks, all of these really high-skilled things that they were learning for 10 years. This wasn't about teaching them any useful trade. It might have been regimenting them mentally so that they could potentially assume a place in a labor force, which is a pretty regimented environment. But basically, they're working to support themselves in a context that they very much didn't want to be in. And that's very similar to the penal context, but it should be no surprise since you got this penal figure who started it. Now, in those first moments, when they're there, it's being explained to them as well as they're taking the physical items away, not to be returned, replacing them with acceptable, uniform, regimented items that will fit the pace of their daily existence from there on out. If we catch you speaking your language beyond a certain point, they usually had a period of grace in which to pick up some degree of functional English. Beyond that, if we find you speaking, if we hear you speaking your language, you'll be punished. If we hear you singing your songs, you'll be punished. If we find you engaged in pagan ceremonies, you'll be punished. If you run, you'll be punished. If we find you with extra food, you'll be punished. So on. Now, punishment here is an interesting thing. Remember who's established a system. Which is why if you go to Haskell or you go to Carlisle, you'll find, and it's marked as such, the guardhouse. This isn't being held on detention. I mean, how could they hold you on detention? They need your labor. You're going to work, you're not being held after class. You can be denied rations. They'll take some of your already, as we'll see in a moment, already substandard in quality and insufficient in terms of quantity food away from you. We'll take the possibility of perks on weekends away from you. We will send you to the guardhouse for 30 days. We will send you to the guardhouse for 60 days, which is the longest stint that I've found. We will hold you in isolation in the guardhouse. We will feed you bread and water. We will put a ball and chain on you. And yeah, the youngest one I found thus far at that was at Haskell, which is in Kansas, 8-year-old child with a ball and chain, actual military ball and chain. They had to modify it because it's a small ankle. Kids tied to posts, kids flogged. This, when we say flogging, we're not talking about a couple swats of the old people in the room who remember this. You go down the hall to the principal's office and he's got this paddle or a strap with or without holes. It stings more with the holes, and you get 2 swats or you get 10 swats or you get whatever you get, and you're done, you're humiliated, and they send you. No, we're talking cat o' nine tail here. All right? They're in common usage. Cat o' nine tail. You got people who had scars for the rest of their lives as a result of discipline administered in the schools. This is not to every student. Okay? But it had the effect it had on the students that it was administered to, and these are always exemplary punishments. Military discipline works that way. So it would be promoted, it would be known. Every student in that school would know, this kid got flogged, he's bleeding, he's in the infirmary. Now when you got a disciplinary structure like that, it's going to attract a peculiar sort of person. Because military discipline is what military discipline is, and I thought I was always pretty twisted to people who lined up to administer the discipline in the first place, but they're at least administering it to adults. not to redeem that, but it takes a quantitatively much more pronounced case of whatever mentally is afflicting them to cause them to want to do that, to make them want to do it to a child. And we're about one step away here from overt active sadism, and guess what? If you got that structure set up, you're going to get the sadists. And so you got people who are taking the cat and they're modifying that, embedding little pieces of iron in it and so forth. Studs. Oh yeah. And then you've got kids who are burned. You've got kids who were scalded for wasting food. You got a little boy over at Williams Lake. It's the only one that I've been able to document, but I'm sure he's not the only one, who had needles run through his tongue because he would not stop speaking his language, and so on and so on. And you have kids who ultimately were beaten to death. Phoenix Indian School had one. Now, it wasn't that he was beaten up and was dead by the time he hit the ground. It was that he was beaten up, he was taken to the infirmary, and he died as a result. You have that. We got a different variation on sadism that we'll take up in a moment. But first we got to get to the nature of this economic basis of the schools and the effects of that. I said they were underfunded. They were underfunded because the government was not willing to, quote, invest the taxpayers' money sufficiently to pick up all the kids, but because they were always having a shortfall in terms of the proportion of kids they could pick up, they took up as much of the slack as they could by underfunding the kids they did have. And it wasn't that it was a time of economic crisis that necessitated this sort of thing. You have a couple of comparative studies that were done in the 1920s, one in Canada that was well publicized, and the other even better publicized down here by the Merriam Commission. And the comparative studies came out with results like this. See, these are not the only residential institutions for kids in either country. If you were a white kid, went to, say, an orphanage, right? They would spend X per day on average to your upkeep. That's food, that's medical support, that's cost of house, so on. The per capita expenditure per day would be X. In the Indian schools, quite uniformly, it was Y. Y was about 1/4 of X. Okay? So you actually do need the kids' labor and the profits accruing from that to maintain the schools in existence. Even at that, there's problems with the quality of the facilities. You have cost-cutting measures. Duncan Campbell Scott, whose counterpart north of the border in Canada during the early 20th century, for example, engages in a cost-cutting measure in the height of a flu epidemic. I mean, kids are dying. But he cuts the costs, budget measure, by removing such medical support as there is in about 2/3 of the schools in Canada, which kind of exacerbates the problem. The problem is exacerbated by the quality of the facilities in the first place. You've got this bare bones or non-existent medical support, and yet the kids are piled into barracks rooms, bunk by bunk by bunk by bunk. Now, in the United States and in Canada, a major killer is at large in society. It's called tuberculosis. When you got people in confined spaces, tuberculosis is much more pronounced danger, kind of like being in the slums, than it would be in the open space or communities where you got some dispersal. Yeah, tuberculosis. What do we understand about tuberculosis, and what did they understand then? Well, by sometime in the late 1870s, it had been pretty clear that someone who contracts tuberculosis requires fresh air, high nutrients, considerable rest. And that if you're packing them in with others all you're going to do is get a bunch of people infected with tuberculosis, okay? Well, these kids are operating on insufficient diet here. I'll explain it this way. Conditions were not particularly favorable under reservations during this early period. I mean, they're destitute. People literally starving in many cases. You had kids that would be taken from Pine Ridge and Rosebud Reservation, which are still the poorest areas in the country. They'd be taken over to the Flandreau Indian School, and on average, 12-year-old males, that was the sample group that they did this particular study on. On average, the 11, 12-year-old age group males would lose 7 pounds during an academic year. They were doing better on the reservation than they were doing in the school. Now, you got a combination of insufficient diet, heavy labor, consequent debilitation, being packed in like sardines with kids who are bringing tuberculosis into the school with them often enough, and no medical support to speak of. Duncan Campbell Scott, roughly 1920, observed publicly, when queried, that 1 in every 2 kids going into a residential school was, how did he put it, not living to see the benefit of the education. In other words, the mortality rate in those schools was 50% during that period. And down here, the data's a little more nebulous, but you've got the Smithsonian study and a couple of others. It's going to be comparable. It's a 50th percentile death rate, which means the schools are losing kids. And the response is to replace them, even though the schools are the incubators of the disease, and not just to replace those who have died, but to increase the overall number of kids in the schools in the face of that mortality rate. Now let me peg that for you in a way which gets me in trouble every time, because nobody wants to hear this one. Oh, you're exaggerating, you're making these false comparisons, you're whatever you're doing. What you're doing is saying something we don't want to hear. So let me say the thing that no one wants to hear. You've heard of Dachau? The death rate in Dachau was about 35th percentile. You've heard of Buchenwald? 19%. Concentration camps run by the Nazis in the 30s, right on through. We're not talking Operation Reinhard camps, extermination centers. That's a different classification of facility. They get conflated all the time to rebut arguments like this. We're talking concentration camps. The worst of the concentration camps in terms of mortality was Mauthausen. Mauthausen's death rate was 62 or 3%, which is 12 or 13% greater than what the death rate was as a result of the conditions imposed as a matter of policy on American Indian children in these schools for their own good. You getting some recursive trauma maybe flickering around in this? Yeah. Well, let me compound it a little more, one more time. Because it's not just a discipline, but it is in this context where children are being psychologically maimed in terms of their own sexuality with the repressive kind of regime that's being imposed upon them. They're also simultaneously being subjected to endemic predation sexually by the staff, by the clergy. A lot of these are run by schools, and so on. You got 2 schools in Canada where it's fairly well established that every single student that was in them in the last generation was sexually molested. Didn't just happen in Boston Archdiocese or LA, okay? Quite predictably, when you got a setup like this is going to be happening. Now, even in schools where it didn't happen to every kid knew it was happening. So you've got this whole virulent stew of conditions. And kids would run and kids would die. That would be known too. You've got lots of, the backbreaker on what was left of the Canadian system happened in the 1960s when a 14-year-old kid named Charlie Winjack ran for the Mohawk Academy and tried to get home in a Canadian winter, which I don't know how many of you have been in Western Ontario in the winter. but he was wearing a windbreaker and tennis shoes. And needless to say, he didn't make it home. And this was in a period where Indians were saying they'd had enough, really had had enough, and some people had gotten media savvy and so forth, and so they're able to make an issue of this. But you had hundreds, unknown number, of children who had met the same fate over the years before. Overall, in this context, you're going to get a certain result. And I've already talked about it in terms of being rendered culturally dysfunctional to one or another extent in terms of your own signification of self, who you were born to be, and the inadmissibility of your newly formed self to the society that formed it, placing you in a catastrophically awkward situation, shall we say. But now trauma, that in itself would generate results, but trauma is another thing. And trauma cannot be avoided as a description of what's being laid on people. We got enough experience with PTSD, they call it. That's a term that gained some traction in understanding the effects of this stuff in the aftermath of Vietnam. But now you've got different vectors of it that have been clinically defined: concentration camp syndrome, Stockholm syndrome having to do with hostage, okay? The kind of psychological effects that impact rape victims, and so on. Natural catastrophes even. There are several studies. Kai Erickson did one with regard to the Johnstown flood. And I mean, you had psychological carnage in that community because nature itself had suddenly and without warning tried to destroy them as individuals, and had in fact destroyed the community quite abruptly, that fast. The world changed. It took them, some of them, the rest of their lives to try to adjust, and some never did. Well, the key to that PTSD business is the word post. Okay? These are the after effects of trauma. Here's a situation that was set up through this assimilation complex that still afflicts Native North America, and this is really the last thing I'm going to say. Trauma is usually event-induced. That's what the therapeutic paradigms are set up. You get raped, you get mugged, you get shot, you have a hideous experience in combat, something happens to you that traumatizes you in a severe fashion. We can now deal with the after effects. Well, that was, for Vietnam vets, when they started working on that, an utterly inadequate paradigm, because it wasn't a trauma. It was a repetitive trauma. If you were in combat in Vietnam, you were getting traumatized on a very regular basis. Much more intractable, much more difficult to deal with, much more deep set. So you've got a Harvard psychologist by the name of Judith Herman that coined a new conceptual understanding of what needed to be worked with, and they began to develop therapeutic models for that as well. She called it complex PTSD. Okay, it's where you have repetitive or recursive trauma. But still, you've got an endpoint. You arrive at the post period. Now you can begin to affect therapeutic intervention. Two things here, all right? First is, the earlier in life the trauma occurs, whether it's event or repetitive, the more deep set and intractable it's going to be. And if it's early enough, say age 4 or 5, it may actually disrupt cognitive formation. So you end up with what they used to call schizophrenia. Okay, you never had a intertwining in appropriate fashion of the various innate streams of consciousness to where they'll form a cohesive whole and allow you to have an identification of self that can act and address the world, okay, understand the world in terms of that self. No, you've got multiple selves happening in there that have never been integrated and continuously arguing in your head. They don't really have a solution to that. You actually get organic transformation in brain as a result of some of this. No repair known. Well, you got kid, the youngest kid I can identify, and there's a picture in the book, is a 3-year-old at Haskell. They were taking kids that young. Now, a kid that young probably is not going to be appreciative of the degree of trauma we're talking about here, but by the time they're 4 and 5, they're going to be in a position to be traumatized in that fashion, and this is a likely outcome. So that's one. You got this much more severe malady as a result of the youthfulness of the people who are subjected to the trauma than is ordinarily addressed in the therapeutic paradigms. And where exactly is the post? When do you get past the trauma? When you're being traumatized by a concerted effort to demean and degrade and nullify an affirmative sense of self, and you get out of the school and they close the school, and then you get to deal with the Washington Redskins, the Kansas City Chiefs, the Florida State Seminoles, Chevy Cheyenne pickups, Jeep Cherokees, Winnebago campers, Red Man chewing tobacco, Big Chief writing tablets, Hiawatha pencils, TP Motel, Squaw Peak, Squaw Creek, 1,400 odd place names in North America with that word. Y'all know what it means? Yeah. The Christian conservative types down in Colorado Springs want to make this an English-only state. You want to take that word, translate it into English slang, and then start, I don't know, call your girlfriend that? Refer to your grandmother as that? How about you trot it in an English-only translation and address the head of women's studies at the University of Colorado by that term? See where you're going to get. You're going to be in one of those health spa, no smoking cells chewing carrot sticks in Boulder before the sun goes down, I'll tell you that. But there's free license, see, to refer. Kind of cute. Bring your squaw. 2,000 Hollywood movies, 10,000 television segments, great American literary giants like James Fenimore Cooper and Last of the Mohicans. And is there an end to this somewhere? You get out of the school with this deformed concept of self, diminished self-esteem, all the rest of that, and it's a continuous tone from there on. And if you complain, there's something wrong with you. Always something wrong with you. Or you got a whole chorus of editors down at the Rocky Mountain News want to argue about it, as they did about the sports team mascots. Indians need to toughen up, get over it. Sour grapes are not appropriate. Social conditions are such that we need all the fun we can have, and after all, this stuff is just good, clean fun. No, it destroys people. The upshot of that is a suicide rate among American Indian men that runs 500% the GPOP average. Among adolescents that runs at Wind River, it was running 1,400% for a while. They were doing little suicide clubs. 7 in every 10 children in northern Manitoba actively inhaling gasoline. 10 in 10 in some areas of Labrador. It's not unknown down in the Pueblos. And 1 in 2 American Indian adults in the 20th century being an acute alcoholic. And they want to talk about whether there's something peculiar in our culture that predisposes us to alcoholism, or do increasingly elaborate DNA studies to discover what our genetic predisposition might be. Which is the dominant society feeding off of what it's created for its own benefit still more. The question to be posed: what's our genetic link to the Irish? Are they not known as the drunken Irish just as we are known as the drunken Indians? And is there some connection between our culture and their culture, our genetic link? No, the link is they were run through the same kind of institutions by the same people for the same reasons we were. They have the same legacy of protracted colonial domination that we do. And if you look at colonial peoples the world over, you're going to find symptomatologies and pathologies that are comparable to this. It's a predictable outcome. If you want to do a PhD study on this, don't go to the DNA side, don't go to the anthrocultural studies side. Just see if you can get the lists of people who were in the boarding schools or who are the children of people who were in the boarding schools. Match them up to those who received treatment for acute alcoholism, and I'll guarantee you, without even having to look at the paper, that you're going to get a near perfect correspondence. 1 in 2 go into schools, 1 in 2 end up alcoholics. And it's transmissible because these people are dysfunctional, trying to get normal, by founding families. They're going to pass along what it was that was done to them to their children. They're not going to have any particular alternative of doing it. They had no understanding of how to function in a familial environment, and after all, they're traumatized and they're in bad shape psychologically themselves, and they've been made disemployable for periods of time, and so on and so on. People act out. You have domestic violence in Indian communities in endemic proportions, and this is a good chunk of the reason why. But now that's traumatizing the kids, even worse than the kids that were in the schools, because whatever else could be said in the schools, the people who were doing it to them were not literally their parents. But now it is their parents, and the kids who ran from the schools, whatever else can be said, were trying to get home. These kids are home. Where do they go? This is genocidal. This is genocidal in every conceivable definitional vector of the term, and it's not something that's consignable to ancient history. It's an ever-present reality today. Now that I've cheered you all up about the social condition, I'm going to stop talking. Thank you very much for listening. Number of survivors, when computed against the acreage, which is about 150 million acres at the time, that remained in native possession, if you assign these parcels, a considerable proportion of the aggregate landholding still in possession of native people could be declared surplus and opened up to homesteading, corporate usage, creation of national parks and forests, military reservations, and so on. And that's the actuality. This undermining of cultural cohesion, the way of doing things, the way of relating to the land and thus to each other, was attacked, redefined in accordance with non-Indian norms, and of that 150 million acres, approximately 100 million acres passed out of Indian ownership and control in the process. That all happened between 1885 and 1934. Actually, it happened more rapidly than that because you had a significant drop-off in allotment after about 1920. So you've got a roughly 35-year period of time where 2/3 of the remaining real assets of native North America are stripped away. That's one wing of the assimilation policy. The other was to go after the children. And it's a theme which is very well grounded. Has been practiced by the papacy. It said, give us the children to be raised in a certain way, they will be believers for life. The Nazis said the same thing. And Hitler was actually paraphrasing the Pope when he said basically, Hitler Youth is designed to create those who will believe what it is.
Mr. Churchill, that he is, and I quote, one of the most outspoken of Native American activists and an amazing, consistent, and perceptive writer. Please join me in welcoming Ward Churchill.
Seal, I'll see you. Hello, my relatives. Good to see you here. It's a hard book for me to talk about, actually. Hardest book I ever wrote. And maybe in the course of my comments, you'll see why. But I suppose first point is that it's an add-on in a way. Got an earlier book titled Little Matter of Genocide, which goes on for 500-odd pages, chronicling the forms, the modes, the impacts, so on, of policies of the United States, of Canada, of antecedent colonial powers upon the indigenous population, all to the purpose of demonstrating the appropriateness and applicability of genocide properly understood, that is, within the domain of its original connotation, when Raphael Lemkin coined the term in 1944, and actually within the legal definition posited in the 1948 Convention on Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide. And with all that, I left out it was more expensive to take out a Chiricahua fighter by the early 1880s in adjusted dollars than it was to kill an actual Vietnamese combatant during the Indochina affair, and that was very expensive, over $1 million per actual combatant killed in Indochina. And it was doing PR damage to the United States, both at home and abroad. So you have a policy shift that occurs in the mid-1880s from this policy of extermination to a policy of assimilating the residue of survivors. The 1890 census shows only about 250,000 American Indians surviving within the 48 contiguous states area of North America. It was felt that the overburden of white population could simply absorb, digest, if you will, this residue, and certain things that went into it. Probably two linchpins defined the whole. One was to protect the cultural integrity that remained among the adults in living the life defined by cultural understanding of indigenous peoples, and that was through the General Allotment Act to break up the collectivity of land holdings that marked traditional land tenure among native peoples pretty comprehensively in North America, and the assignment, imposition, if you will, of individuated land title at about 160 acres a pop. Given the known number.
Kill the Indian, Save the Man has the most interesting and poignant cover. As you can see, it shows a young boy dressed in the clothing of his Native American tribe, and then the same youngster dressed in the clothing worn by other young boys in the United States and Canada in the 19th century. Ward Churchill has chosen that picture to illustrate the theme of his book about the American Indian residential schools and their lasting effect on the Native American population in this country and Canada. Mr. Churchill is a professor of American Studies at the University of Colorado, a member of the Leadership Council of the American Indian Movement of Colorado, past national spokesperson for the Leonard Peltier Defense Committee, delegate to the United Nations Working Group on Indigenous Populations, and a member of the People's International Tribunal. And plus, with all of that, he is a prolific writer and a well-known speaker on Native American issues. This book explores a policy little known to many of us of the United States and Canadian governments that put Native American children in residential schools away from their families and culture. A situation, Mr. Churchill writes, that has led to social disintegration and has resulted in the ills that have plagued the Native American peoples. Publishers Weekly has said of
a lot, and the quite a lot that I left out included the impacts of what the United States somewhat euphemistically referred to as assimilation policy. I do touch upon it. I do mention the dimension of schooling in that process and a little amount of genocide, but there is no development thematically. And in the aftermath of having written that, I was aware of it. As we are all aware of things in a sort of abstract way, not personal. Well, I got crash course in the personal experience of the effects of that system after Little Matter of Genocide was published. So this book really is a chunk of what's missing in the larger book that preceded it. And the general structure of what's presented in there is as follows. That is, at the end of an overt policy of extermination, and that's not my term, that's the term utilized by figures like Governor Evans of Colorado Territory at the time of the Sand Creek Massacre, and quite a number of other renowned figures in American history. The extermination policy was phased out as being detrimental to the interests of the United States in several ways. One, is becoming increasingly cost prohibitive to track down the hardcore recalcitrants, Geronimo's Chiricahuas, for example.